So I want to talk a little bit about ethical decision making. You're all going to go through the tenets of ethical decision making, the CPC, the Code of Professional Conduct. And yes, there are dogs barking. I always have dogs barking here. Dogs, dogs, dogs. Um, I developed a framework for teaching ethical decision making and for teaching and for mentoring and things like that. And that's called DECIDE, DECIDE. You have the handout in your Blackboard course documents. I want you to start applying that framework to making decisions. And I'll go through that pretty quickly. So the first D is to determine whether this is an interpreting issue. There are lots of times that there are what I call yucky situations that if we jump into the middle of them, we might make them worse. They're really not interpreting issues. So the question would be, there are two scenarios I'll give you, and you can think about whether one's an interpreting issue and one's just a yucky issue situation, and we really can't do much about it. So teacher is teaching first day, let's say, and the teacher is using the approach to ask students in the classroom to answer questions. And so let's just say she, because all teachers are mostly she's, not always. So she asks questions, answer, questions, answer, questions, answer. And I don't have time to get the interpretation off my hands. And so Johnny, who is the deaf student in the class, is not able to participate in the question and answer. So the decision is this an interpreting issue or is this just a yucky situation? And I'll let you talk about that in Blackboard. Another scenario is that the teacher doesn't ever calls on students but never calls on Johnny. And so is that an interpreting issue or is that just a yucky situation? So in the case of a yucky situation, you just stop right there. There's really nothing you can do. There is nothing you can do because it's not an interpreting issue. In the case of an interpreting issue, then you move on to the next level of analysis to determine what to do. What I caution you on right now is don't jump to, this is what I would do. Hold on for all of these ethical dilemmas that you're going to work on in class. Don't jump to the end. I want you to go through DECIDE and then get to the end. So the next one is to evaluate the conflicts. And basically what we're going to do is not rehash what the conflict is. It's what are the tenets that are at stake here? What are laws that might be at stake here? What are some policies, school policies that might be at stake here if it's a school-based dilemma? Because I need to know what these conflicts are. So what's the CPC tenets that might be at risk? What are any laws that might be at risk? And any policies or guidelines where I'm working. So I need to define those. What are those? And then I need to consider the stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders who are at risk here? Basically, you don't have an ethical dilemma if you don't have stakeholders. If you don't have two people with competing interests, because that's the basis of an ethical dilemma, is that you have two competing interests. And you're in the middle of this one, so in the case that it's an interpreting issue. So stakeholders I think about as primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary people are the people in the room who are actually using the interpretation. And so in the case of, let's say, a courtroom, people who are using the interpretation are a judge, the lawyers, the defendant. Okay? They're actually depending on the interpretation. And anybody watching, they're depending on the interpretation as well. The jury is depending on the interpretation. The bailiff is not depending on the interpretation, but the bailiff is in the room. So that person is secondary. They're in the room, they're impacted, but they're not really depending on the interpretation. And then we have tertiary. Those people are involved somehow, they're impacted by our decisions, but they're not in the room. So the interpreting agency that sent me is definitely a tertiary stakeholder. My family is a tertiary stakeholder. the interpreter that's going to come after me is a tertiary stakeholder, because whatever decision I make will impact the next interpreter coming behind me. The person who's the most important the most important interpreter is the one that came before me, because they set the stage for how these people are going to act and interact with me. So primary, secondary, and tertiary, you have to identify who the stakeholders are. Then we move to the DECI. We identify possible solutions. And with this, I want you to think about at least 3 possible solutions for this dilemma. And when you identify the 3 possible solutions, what I want you to do is also say how it impacts those laws, tenets, and policies and guidelines that may have been impacting this dilemma, and the stakeholders. So you have to flesh out then whether this solution is the best one or the optimal one or not. Same thing with this one. How does it impact the possible risk or conflict with the CPC tenets, laws, policies, guidelines? Same with this one. During that analysis, you should come to the next one, which is the next D, and determine the best solution. So one of these is going to rise to the top and become the best solution.